This week on the Futurists, Kasey Lobaugh.
The historic record would say, no, every time we've automated jobs, we've created new ones.
Yeah.
And the question is this like it's always been, or is something different now? My own instinct tells me something is different.
Welcome back to yet another episode of The Futurists. I'm Rob Tercek, and here's my co-host.
Hey, Brett King, I'm here.
Brett,
yeah, I'm actually in North Carolina this week, so but back to Thailand end of next week.
Globetrotter.
Yeah,
good to have you back. Good to be back with you this time. We've both been traveling quite a bit. And man, the future keeps coming. There's been a tremendous flood of news and information and so forth. One of the things that we've been eager to do, though, now that we're both back on the show together, is interview a real futurist, somebody who is spending their career thinking about
career futurist. Yeah,
that's exactly
futurist.
Right. A professional futurist, if you will. And so we reached out to a longtime acquaintance of mine, and at a company that everybody's going to be familiar with. Let's give a big welcome to Kasey Lobaugh. Kasey, hi.
Hey, Robert. How are you?
Hey,
Brett. How are you? Thank you for having me on.
Happy to have you here. So, Brett, Kasey is the chief futurist for the consumer industry, which he's going to explain what that means, for the firm Deloitte Consulting. And for those who aren't aware,
I'm an alum from Deloitte Consulting.
Oh, so. I didn't. Oh, that's cool. Tell me about that.
No. I was I was director of e-business at an Asia Pacific during the .com era for Deloitte. Originally started with Deloitte in Australia, then they moved me to the Hong Kong office, which was the headquarters for Asia at the time. But of course, back in those days, it was all very industry focused. So that's, I had to choose an industry. So I chose financial services, of course, right? That's right.
Well, that's a good setup for this conversation because Kasey is focused. He's the futurist for the consumer industry. And I was a little unclear exactly what that means. So Kasey, tell us a little bit about the consumer industry and what it means to be a futurist there.
Yeah, excellent, Robert. And first of all, Brett, I love the fact that you're an alumni at Deloitte. We have alumni everywhere. And of course, I really always appreciate meeting people. You and I were catching up a little bit on our parallel paths from back in the day. But nonetheless, the consumer industry for us, we think about it like this, is that, the consumer, has their wallet's divided two ways. You've got your non-discretionary spending, and then you've got discretionary spending. And discretionary spending really is a broad collection of dollars that are spent by the consumer on everything from autos to hotels, restaurants, retail, consumer packaged goods, and I'm sure I'm leaving other categories out here, convenience stores, supermarkets, et cetera. All of that for us falls into what we call the consumer industry, because the same forces that are guiding the economics of the consumer and their decisions and their lifestyle really affect all of those categories. And so we think really broadly about how the consumer may be changing, about how they're interacting with those categories, spending money differently, evolving over time. So that's how we get to this idea of the consumer industry.
Okay, so it's way broader than I had imagined when I first heard about this. But you leave a couple categories out. So it doesn't include spending on energy. Does it include things like mortgages, or is that outside of that as well?
That would be outside. So we've got financial services that would be a separate industry for us, or at least the way we think about it, though there is relationship. And we certainly spend a lot of time talking about the relationships. One of the industries that would be separate would be healthcare. However, you'll hear me talk about this today about the convergence of these industries and where consumer and healthcare are coming together. And energy, while we wouldn't put the energy companies in the consumer category, certainly the venues through which we're selling energy to the consumer are within the purview of the consumer category. So, for example, a convenience store would absolutely be considered a consumer industry company for us.
That's a good illustration of convergence, because just about every gas station now seems to have a little mini market attached to it. And so that's a good tiny micro example of this kind of convergence you're describing, where the boundaries are being blurred between, right, consuming energy and consuming, a candy bar or a can of soda. But basically, so you're focused on discretionary spending in the home. But one thing that blurs those categories is also that people are cutting back on non-discretionary. For instance, healthcare as an example. As the cost of that continues to go up, people are trying to find ways to maybe cut back on that so that they can go buy a new iPhone or something else.
Yeah, and even as we talk about that,
why waste your money on insulin? Seriously,
Yeah.
It's crazy, right? They're crazy that we have to make those decisions in this day and age. But
Yeah, that's right. It's right. And you can't focus on just the non-discretionary or just the discretionary portion of the wallet without recognizing the changes that are happening on the non-discretionary side.
Yeah. Because the big macro change is that the price of everything is going up. I know the inflation story is not new. But really, the inflation story goes way back to 2008. We've seen inflation in asset prices that's for more than a decade, and as a result, the cost of housing has gone up. We're also seeing that kind of steady rise in the price of automobiles as people switch to EVs. Those cost something like 20-25% more than an internal combustion car. So costs are rising across the board. How are consumers reacting to them?
Actually, well, let me address this question about costs are rising across the board, because you did exactly what we've done, is sort of go back over a longer range and think about, because of course everybody wants to talk about inflation today, but if you go back all the way back to 2000, you'll find that there's two distinct categories, roughly divided between non-discretionary and discretionary. What you'll find is categories like hospital services, college tuition, college textbooks, medical services, child and nursery school care. All of those have been on an incredibly strong inflationary tear, much longer horizon than the inflation pressure that we're talking about now. Conversely, though, if you looked at TVs, toys, computer software, computer services, cell phone services, even clothing, you'll find that there's been an incredible deflationary pressure for quite some time. And even when you put it in the context of the recent inflation, you'll still see that over that time period, we're having incredible deflation. Even just as this week, as the new inflation report came out, you see the same exact division showing up in the inflation report that we get even over this week. So you have to recognize this, back to this comment about like the more we inflate costs on the non-discretionary side, that actually steals from the discretionary wallet. And that's part of the question of the future: has something structurally changed or not?
It's even more like, I don't know, straightforward than that, which is real wage growth has been absent in the US and UK, and Australian economies, to name a few, for 40 years, effectively.
That's right.
Real wage growth has stagnated. So, with more and more automation coming in, there's going to be more and more pressure on wage growth. And corporations are going to be making a decision to jump in with AI in preference of paying higher salaries for individuals as well. So this problem is not going away.
That's right.
And we talk about economic impact at a consumer level and CPI and so forth, but let's not forget that consumption is a major element of economic growth. And this is why when we talk about population growth shrinking, it's a major problem for the Chinese economy moving forward. The one-child policy, because they don't have all those consumers in the middle class getting more affluent and consuming. There's a logical limit to that, and there's an argument that the US, with its immigration policy, over the last 100 years or so, has really stimulated consumption by importing buyers into the economy, and that's a key element. So, consumption at a discretionary and non-discretionary basis is very important, for the health of an economy. And when you have, you don't have that wage growth in terms of spending dollars, and you got the spending crunch on both ends of it coming, then that's going to have a deleterious effect to the economy over time.
Absolutely. If you thought about the birth rate in the US, if you look at where we're at today, we're now below the replacement level. So without immigration over the next decade, we'll have fewer people.
Right.
And
we've covered the topic quite a bit on the show. It's actually across the entire Northern Hemisphere. No population in the Northern Hemisphere is above replacement rate at this point. They're all hovering below two children per couple. That's a real problem for the long-term growth of the economy and for Social Security. Kasey, let me roll back to something that you said, because I think it's an important distinction that we didn't get to cover. Just building on what Brett was talking about, we've now seen two big factors in the economy that go back many decades. One is what Brett was referring to, which is the stagnation of real income or real wages. That's been a gigantic issue for working people. But at the same time, there's been this steady increase and rather a spectacular increase in certain categories. And the categories that are growing are those that are services, particularly services that require a lot of people, education, college, healthcare. And that's put a real squeeze on household budgets. Those two factors put a squeeze on household budgets. So manufacturers of consumer goods, they're smart. They see this trend. They understand they've pivoted and they've found ways to squeeze out cost. And so the cost of things, of stuff, material goods, that's dropped, right? We can actually say there's been, like you talked about, a deflationary pressure there. In a way, that's necessity, right? Because otherwise people would stop buying stuff. We also notice that in the quality of the products that we buy, because a lot of products, as they squeeze out cost, they're actually literally squeezing out material. The weight of packages has decreased, for instance, over the last 25 years significantly. Is that part of what you analyze when you look at the consumer industry, those kinds of factors?
Yeah, without a doubt. So
Okay.
we went out through a process and really tried to figure out what are all the things we need to pay attention to, which was a really, extensive and difficult process. But through that process, we surfaced well over 100 distinct things that we thought we needed to pay attention to. And every topic that we've raised so far on this conversation have been topics that without a doubt were part of what were raised through that conversation. So we're trying to study all of those, continually monitor those, and then more importantly is understand what they mean and what happens when they converge.
Okay, let's dig a little deeper into that, because methodology is a topic that we love to get into in the show, particularly in the beginning of the show. So you're a futurist, you're working for this global consulting firm, and you're looking at the future of the consumer industry. Now, some of what you've done is you've taken a look at historical trends. And I fully agree with that. You can't forecast unless you understand the long-term trajectory of where we're coming from. So that makes a good deal of sense. You're also looking at multiple factors. You mentioned 100 different factors. But you've also created a kind of a formulation. You've got these 6 factors that you zero in on. Can you tell us a little bit about the 6 factors that define the future?
Yeah, sure thing. And by the way, with the 6 factors were more of an organizing construct that we applied after we surfaced the 100 or so things. So the first effort was just to really, sometimes I refer to it as like shake the bushes. Let's see what all falls out. Let's see all the topics that, and I'll talk about sort of the broad group that we pulled together. But the question was, what all do we have to care about? Now, as we did that, 100 or so things becomes almost overwhelming. But then we started playing the game of how do you organize them and which things are like each other, et cetera. And ultimately, we came up with what we call the 6 forces shaping the future of the consumer industry. Now, those forces are the first one is really about a changing consumer. And so for us, if you look at the consumer, it's demographics, the changing demographics, it's sexuality and gender identity, it's economics, it's geography, it's wealth and wealth disparity, income disparity, all those elements that sort of make up those dimensions of the consumer. That's the first one. The second one is really society and culture, because that consumer, who they are, is defined by how they relate to a broader culture, how they relate to neighbors, how they form groups, and how those groups help define who they are, and frankly, what's important to them in terms of spending. So a lot of what we do as consumers, relates to us trying to represent or participate in society and culture. The third component is it's really technology, but we call it X-Tech. Now, this is our own term that we've come up with that really tries to convey a broader collection of technologies than just infotech. We're trying to convey, specifically for our consumer clients that think deeply about infotech a lot, that when we say the word technology, we're also talking about biotech and material science and advances in space and other technologies that are increasingly converging and becoming important for our industry to understand and talk about. The fourth element is industry upheaval. And it's really a specific view of what are the things happening with the industry, some of which are financial. So, for example, consumer spending over the last decade grew about 3.6% CAGR. However, many consumer companies would love to have a 3.6% growth CAGR during the same period. So why are companies not performing at the rate of consumer spending? And there's some reasons behind that. But you also have declining barriers to entry, fragmentation of market share. There's a lot happening when you just analyze the industry that's actually really causing significant upheaval. Of course, all of this operates, within the context of an extreme climate and planet. Of course, the consumer and consumer industry, as I've defined it, produces 60% of all the greenhouse gases. So that begins to tell you the role that this industry must play. And, in many ways, you'll know this is that we're on a dire trajectory now.
Yeah.
But when you recognize that we've got about 3.9 billion consumers globally today, and we're going to add another 2 billion over the next decade, this idea of what role our industry must play as it pertains to the planet becomes much more emphasized.
Well, I want to drill down onto that. So tell me, I'll let you finish your thought.
All right, just one more category of the 6. It's shifting economics, it's policy, it's power and politics. And of course, that's a broad collection of things, but they're the things that, are defining the rules, the behaviors, the economics of how we're operating as a broader economy. What we're trying to incent, where we're finding, changing policies that would be the wrappers around the industry. So there's a lot in that category, but those are the 6 categories that we came up with for the 100 or so topics.
Okay, cool. We're going to have questions, of course.
Yeah. There's plenty there to go into.
Let's just briefly recap for the people who are listening. So there's 6 factors. One is the changing consumer. The second one is an evolving society. The third one is exponential technology. Then the fourth is radical industry upheaval, radical change coming to industries. And then the fifth is radical climate change.
Yep.
And then finally, the last one is the policies that govern the allocation of resources. So you could say government and politics and so on. That's just a quick recap. Now, Brett, I know you're chomping at the bit to jump in there, so don't let me stop you.
Let's do it.
Well, so I think what's interesting about this, if you look at a number of these, obviously there's consumer pressures and there's trends, technologies change behavior. Look at the smartphone, look at social media, obviously. But on a broader basis, when it comes to actually reshaping industry, it's almost as if, and this is what I argue in technosocialism in the book, it's almost a philosophical fork in the road, because extreme climate change in particular, but also the fact that technology is going to upheave a lot of these industries. Look at healthcare, going to be biotech, gene therapy, better sensor technologies, all of these sort of things. All of the old skill sets of the Industrial Revolution essentially evaporate. So you have entirely new basis of sort of value creation at a market level, but at the same time, you have the need for corporations and industry to be net social positive rather than just using resources to create profits. And
that's right.
It doesn't matter if we pollute the earth and and kill people because of pollution or whatever. So you have this sort of almost a renaissance. I would call it, in terms of where corporations fit into the world in respect to their broader social mission. Do you think that is an outcome for this, or will capitalism win out, in respect to it doesn't matter as long as you're still making profits? Because how well has that worked for us today with climate change, right?
Yeah, no, we're pushing on the idea. So I agree with you completely that we have to get corporations to recognize that their role that they have to play in this renaissance, this change that's before us, is significantly different than where we've come from. You'll hear us, and we've done our report that we call Buying into Better. And Buying into Better is really trying to encapsulate that idea for the consumer industry. We have to traverse the complexity that's before us, but we also have to make choices that impact society, our consumer base, our neighbors. We have to play a different role than our industry has played historically. That's one of the big outcomes that comes out of the study that we've done.
And in some respects, industry is on defense because the consumer is changing. The consumer's empowered. The consumer's able to make decisions. Like today, the 3.9 billion people you mentioned, they all have a smartphone in their pocket. So they've got abundant choices. They can be shopping in another online store, even while they're inside of a retail shop. This is unprecedented territory for retailers and for the consumer goods business. We're going to get into that in the second half.
Yeah.
But I think what we should probably do now is we like to do this special procedure with our guests. And it's going to be Brett that administers the procedure this time. It's our rapid fire round. We're going to ask you a bunch of quick questions so that audience can get to know you a little bit better. Go for it, Brett.
Okay, here is the lightning round. What was the first science fiction you remember being exposed to on TV, books, film?
So as you asked the question, I remember Land of the Lost, TV show when I was young that, really was interesting and caught my attention.
Reminds me a lot of that time tunnel. Remember the time tunnel? And that was funny. What technology has most changed humanity to date, do you think?
It's got to be the connectivity. That we achieve through internet connection. So just broadly, the connectivity of information, the flow of information.
Very cool. So you call yourself a futurist, but can you name a futurist or an entrepreneur that really influenced you in your career?
So I follow Ray Kurzweil, and I think my introduction to him and his thinking through Singularity University probably prompted me to really start digging deeper into a broader set of understanding of trends.
And we've had a few Singularity people on, like Ramez and others. In terms of the forecasting element, what do you think is the best prediction or best forecast a entrepreneur or a futurist or a sci-fi practitioner has ever made?
I don't know. I don't know that I have an answer to that. I don't know that there's in fact, I focus a lot on bad forecasts because I'm trying to learn as much from when bad forecasts were made as I am trying to figure out what forecasts are the right ones.
There's a lot more bad forecasts out there, so you have no shortage of examples.
Yeah.
All right, so last one. Is there a science fiction story that is representative of the future you hope for?
So there's a book that came out last year called AI 2041.
Oh, yeah, with Kai-Fu Lee.
Yeah. And I think within that, there are some great stories. I love what they did is brought together science fiction with, actual people that are in the industry that are tracking with technology. I think there's some really great stories in that begin to paint a profound picture of the potential. Of course, some of the stories paint a picture of the dystopian possibilities.
Yeah.
But within that are some real utopian outcomes that are possible.
Yeah, I tried that in Augmented, actually, with my book in 2015. I told 3 stories at the end about, like science fiction stories embedded in the book, short stories. So I think it's a good technique. It works. I mean, think about the Motorola flip phone, right? And it's influenced by the Star Trek communicator, right?
And one of the things I've noticed in doing scenario planning with client companies is after you get a certain distance out into the future, say 5 years or more, it's all storytelling. And once you get out to like a 10-year horizon, it's science fiction at that point because you're taking trends that you're aware of. You're going to try to extrapolate. But you can't do a linear extrapolation because it never works that way.
I call my futurism short-term sci-fi. Yeah, for that reason.
I think that makes a good deal of sense. All right. Well, that has been a fun round. Thanks, Kasey, for answering those questions. We're going to take a short break, but folks, don't go far because we're going to be right back with Kasey Lobaugh in part 2.
Provoke Media is proud to sponsor, produce, and support the Futurist podcast. Provoke.fm is a global podcast network and content creation company with the world's leading fintech podcast and radio show, Breaking Banks. And of course, its spin-off podcast, Breaking Banks Europe, Breaking Banks Asia Pacific, and the FinTech 5. But we also produce the official Finovate podcast, Tech on Reg, Emerge Everywhere, the podcast of the Financial Health Network, and Next Gen Banker. For information about all our podcasts, go to provoke.fm or check out Breaking Banks, the world's #1 fintech podcast and radio show. Welcome back to the Futurists. I'm your host, Brett King, with Rob Tercek in the hosting seat, and our guest this week, Kasey Lobaugh. Kasey, in terms of constructing this sort of research and so forth, how do you come up with the thesis behind this in terms of, as a futurist, what's going to add value from a corporate perspective?
So as we set out, as I mentioned before, I was worried about making predictions. I was worried because there's so many bad predictions, that really found their way into our industry, into the conventional wisdom. So the first thing I thought about was, well, how will we go about it in a way that isn't just me sitting in a room prophesizing? And the way I thought about it was to think about the process. If you believe in the process, you believe in the outcome. So we set out to really define a robust process with great input, diverse input. So at this point, we've interviewed and involved in workshops over 800 people. Those are certainly people from across the industry that have expertise in the various sectors that make up the industry, many people within Deloitte, but we also interviewed a whole collection of clients. We talked with every major industry group that makes up the industry. I went to academia. We talked with institutes that study the future. We talked with places like we had MIT Media Lab, spent a day with them. Wall Street analysts, economists, sociologists. We just tried to be really robust. We also we had a group of the youngest people at Deloitte, our youngest professionals. We engaged them in a conversation. And then we also have a consumer tracker where we survey consumers every month across 20 different countries. That was also an input. So what we try to do is really make sure that we had a holistic view. And of course, you'll know this, is that no one person amongst that group had the complete view of all the things that were going on that mattered. So it was only because we were able to convene such a great group could we have a really broad view of what were the forces that are coming together.
So you took diverse inputs, both demographically in terms of age and geographically, but also from a number of different businesses, right? So when you say
That's
consumer industry, you're talking about everything from food and fashion and apparel to consumer electronics and consumer goods. So that's pretty broad as well. So you're getting diverse inputs, but I imagine you end up with this kind of scattering of snapshots. How do you then unify that into a cohesive whole?
Yeah, you're right. That was the first part, which was a bit mind-bending to have the complexity and the sheer amount of information that we brought together. And then it was a bit of an organizing effort. Which of these things are like each other? Which of these conflict with each other? Because, of course, one person would say things are going left. Another person would say things are going right. And then we actually set out to do the research. Within Deloitte, luckily, I have enough resources to convene a team and set about the research on each of the topics that came up. As we did that, they started to form into the 6 categories that we shared earlier. And now we've got the platform of information, and really we're establishing the processes now to keep it evergreen and make sure that we're staying on top of the changing forces.
And what did you learn in the process? What were the findings, or let's say the implications?
Yeah. So, the first step was the 6 forces. But at that point, all we've said is, man, there's a lot going on. And really what our clients want to know is, but what does it mean to us?
Right.
And so then we set out with trying to think about, how do you work your way through the implications? And imagine for a minute, what does this mean for both airlines and for fast food? And those were that was the challenge, right? So we developed a model that we call the 3M model for the industry. So the 3 M's would be markets. What does it mean for markets? And for that, what is being sold? Who's buying it? How are we selling it? How is it changing? How are value propositions changing? The second M is models. So think business models. How are we organizing ourselves as business units? How are we sourcing capabilities? How are ecosystems changing by which we operate? And then the third is mechanics. And it's really, how do we run our business? What role does labor play? How are we changing the granularity of execution that we're having to execute at? How do we think about the financial mechanics of how we generate profitability? Those are all the things that sort of fall under each of those.
Such a consulting way to
it's beautiful.
Well, you need a methodology. It's fun for us to dissect the methodology. But even as you're saying those things, I'm starting to relate the 3 M's that you mentioned back to your 6 different factors that are going to cause change. So for instance, in mechanics, we can think about automation, and we can think about robotics and artificial intelligence changing the way a business operates, right?
But
in terms of models, you can see there's a big shift now that's been underway for some time from selling a single unit to selling either bulk or subscription, right? So that's you're starting to see subscription to dog food. Just about anything you might buy on a regular basis is available on a subscription basis now from Amazon. So that's not necessarily new, but that's certainly a big trend. So is that the kind of methodology you're talking about, just to give it some specific?
Yeah, without a doubt. But let me add a couple of additional colors, because the things you hit on are right. Under mechanics, we also talk a lot about workforce extremes, where there's some component of the workforce that's in high demand, and there's another portion of the workforce that's at risk of being created redundancy.
Big topic there.
Right.
Go into that. Tell us more about that.
Yeah. So if you look at the estimates, right, we've got roughly 190 million jobs in the United States, and somewhere between, depending on who you look to, between 40 and 70 million of those jobs are at risk of being automated away in the next decade. Yeah. So, as you dig into that, you have to ask yourself, not only what does it mean for our workforce, but the workforce is also the consumer base. So we know for a healthy consumer industry, we need a healthy consumer base. And you have to begin to recognize, what does it potentially mean for the changing workforce dynamics? And that's
this is the original Henry Ford insight, that if you pay your workers a reasonable wage, they can afford to buy your product, right? And that was, at the time, he was considered almost socialistic, right? People were outraged that he was paying his workers so much, but he managed to get the best workers, so it paid off for him.
That's right.
Now we have businesses going the opposite direction, where the current hoopla around artificial intelligence is, I think it's somewhat overhyped in the near term, but long-term implications are clear.
Sure. Yeah.
Workers are going to get displaced, right? I think that's an inevitable conclusion as you think through the possibilities for applied artificial intelligence.
Yeah, I heard Gary Vee had a good illustration of this the other day. I don't know if you heard it, Rob, but he said AI is the tractor. If you look at farming and agriculture in the United States, prior to the Industrial Revolution, 75% of workers worked in the farming agriculture sector. Today, it's 1.3%, right? Yeah. And so that's happened because of the tractor. And AI is the new tractor. But the question mark is, where are all the new jobs going to come from? When AI disrupts. And that's a social question. It's not a employment labor force question. It's sort of the role of work in society is sort of redefined by AI.
Well, it's a great debate.
Yeah.
And that debate always comes up through conversation. But if you break down what roles do humans play in the workforce, it's really one of three. First is physical. We're doing physical work, like working on a manufacturing line. Second is we're doing cognitive work, making decisions like buying decisions, et cetera. And then the third would be creative work. Now, the idea would be that, historically, every time we automate away work, we create new jobs. Now, the question is, what are those new jobs going to be, to your question? And can technology displace those jobs? So we clearly are seeing cognitive with some of the AI examples that exist in the marketplace, but we're also seeing creative, right? With generative AI. And what I'm questioning, and it's just part of this debate, is, at least historically, there's always been a category of jobs that couldn't be automated, and we elevated to those jobs. But I'm not sure, as we sit here today, that there's a category of those three categories that can't be affected by technology.
No, but that's the point, is we are seeking to build AI that could disrupt all of those, right? Artificial general intelligence.
And the key thing is simultaneously, right? So it's not sequential. Right. Yeah. And so there's no place to go in the short run. Yeah. I would also add that
across every industry simultaneously. Exactly.
Yeah, that's right. And robotics destroys entire job categories, and it does it simultaneously across industries. So, for instance, just about every grocery store, drugstore, and hardware shop now has automated checkout counters, right? Not 100%, but the bulk of the checkout areas are now self-service and automated. So that eliminates the job of the clerk who does the scanning and runs the cash register. But the problem is that person can't go across the street when their job's destroyed, because the company across the street, for competitive reasons, had to adopt the same technology. And so the category's gone. That's new. That's kind of new, and that's a little bit scary. But Brett, the thing that bothers me the most about this scenario, the thing that troubles me the most, I think, is AI is taking jobs that haven't even been invented yet.
Right.
So the really creative application of artificial intelligence is to apply it to things that humans don't yet do.
Mhm.
But then that closes an avenue for the future, right? So you can imagine easily that in the three categories you mentioned, Kasey, physical work that's being replaced by automation and machines, and eventually robotics that's been underway for a couple hundred years, cognitive work that's being replaced by artificial intelligence and machine learning, and then creative work. The new generative AIs certainly represent a pretty significant threat, even in their kind of infant stage. I think they still are kind of an infant stage, but the potential is quite clear, right? So where do we go next? Well, the things you might do next, those are already being cornered by artificial intelligence. That's where the scenario gets scary. There's no next place to go to. Challenge me if I'm wrong, because I really do want to hear a counter to that.
This, as I mentioned, this is the debate. My mind always goes where you went. However, the historic record would say, no, every time we've automated jobs, we've created new ones.
Yeah.
And the question is this like it's always been, or is something different now? My own instinct tells me something is different.
Well, we know it's different because we've never had the technology to replicate what a human does. Right. You know, so that's the difference, is that humans are interchangeable with an algorithm or a robot now. That's never been the case before. So anything you can train a human to do, you'll be able to train an algorithm or a robot to do in the future. So then the question is, well, if you can train an algorithm or AI to do anything a human can do, how can a human differentiate? And the answer is we can't. So this leads to, then whether you employ an AI or whether you employ a human is purely an economic decision in today's terms. And that's the key problem. The key problem is that we don't have an economic system that will value human workers over machines. And to be fair, whenever we think about science fiction and these utopian futures, we have always modeled that on the basis of eliminating work that is menial, and getting you to things that are really truly interesting and because it sort of advanced the species, art and science, etc. But it's a really interesting question, because I think ultimately, we're getting to that point where, we disrupt the role of humans in society. And, if you're trying to tie that into, economic performance of the economy and labor participation and all of that, all of those rules get broken by this.
Brett, let me build with some of our industry specific insights on this, because not only are we talking about machines doing what humans can do. If you look at the industry is evolving in a way that there's things that need to be done that you can't actually use humans to do. Right. So, Robert, you mentioned this earlier, this, explosion of optionality. We like to say the market has shifted from being supply driven, the consumer industry, to being really demand driven, meaning the consumer has more options and therefore they're making choices that are not constrained by the availability of supply. And that means that the market is shifting from supply driven to demand driven. We use the term moving from mass to micro. Right. The industry was built for mass production, mass distribution, mass marketing. And however, that's how companies are built. Those are requirements we built for. We're moving to more of a micro segmentation of the market. And the problem is that if you try and apply humans to this level of granularity of decision making, let me use just a quick example to highlight this. If you go into most of your favorite retailers in Omaha, Nebraska, or in Dallas, Texas, or Florida, what you're going to find is they're generally the same. However, they're moving rapidly away from that. Let's call this hyper-localized assortment. To say the store in North Kansas City and South Kansas City have very different consumers. Demographics are really fragmenting, needs, wants, desires, etc. So therefore, in order to compete with this market that has more options, you have to become hyper-relevant.
Wow.
Now,
how does a national chain deal with that? Like, how does it?
The problem is that the traditional way is you have a merchant who's planning the assortment. But if you now have 1,500 stores, you have 1,500 assortments to plan and predict. And it's possible with data, for sure. We've proven it's possible. But it's not possible to have 1,500 humans with 1,500 spreadsheets, managing that level of complexity. So it's not just a matter of, hey, can humans do it? It's actually, no, the requirements of what needs to be done are changing. And you can only do that through a different approach utilizing technology. So it's not a simple replacement. It's an evolution to where the requirements are so complex that you can't do it the old way. That makes sense?
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. Let me offer an alternative scenario, and I don't know if this fits, but this is what's on my mind when I hear you talk about that. So certainly, as I looked at the report, I get your point about the proliferation of diverse choices and optionality, and in a way that like speaks to what we all experience when we go on Amazon: cognitive overload, right? So I use Amazon because it's fun to pick on Amazon. The UI there, if you're searching for just a generic product, you're going to end up with 10,000 choices. Many of them look identical, and many of them are coming from obscure companies that you've never heard from, and so forth. So for the consumer, this is a feeling of cognitive overload.
Sure.
And one reaction to that I've noticed is consumers go on strike. They just say, I'm going to buy less stuff. Partly that's a reaction to the fact that wage growth has been stagnating for many years. That cost of other things have gone up, that it's absorbing on my budget and so on. What happens when buyers go on strike? And if AI is going to really displace a lot of workers, you're going to see many people who were formerly consumers who are now no longer able to purchase.
I mean, this is the whole argument for universal basic income is we keep people consuming, right?
Yeah, but
that's in itself a problem, right?
Yeah, who pays for it, right? There's no way.
That's a can of worms right there.
Oh my God. It's like, that is the most utopian scenario I've ever heard. But look,
as an alternative to, 60% unemployment, it's a reasonable position, right?
Sure, it's reasonable. If you start to do the math on even giving a small stipend like $2,000 a month, you get into trillions of dollars just in the United States alone.
Sure.
Any other nation, by the way, the economic get worse. It's much harder to do. $2,000 a month is not enough to support a person right now in a major city in the United States. But the cost of that per capita, if you multiply it across the whole population of the U.S., is close to $8 trillion a year. And that's more than the United States government takes in taxes right now. And already Americans are overtaxed, right? So like half the population here would go into insurrection if you tried to raise taxes. I just don't see how you can tax it.
Well, so either you have to ban AI so humans keep working, or you have to have UBI and you have to figure out how to pay for it. I mean, that's the binary option, right? What's the alternative?
Yeah. So for the people who want to keep working, the implication is clear. You got to master working with the machines, and you've got to upskill and stay ahead. And by the way, not an easy thing to do. I've been investigating prompt craft here, partly because my social media crowd has been hassling me to get better at prompt craft. So I'm feeling the social heat to get on top of it. And, it's necessary to keep your blade sharp. You got to keep practicing. You got to in order to stay relevant. I'm not sure that every worker feels that way, though. I think there's quite a lot of people in the workforce who are like, I'm not going to upskill. And that's like a choice to become obsolete. This is a really scary scenario, right? And Brett, it reminds me of a diagram from your book, Technosocialism, where you gave 4 scenarios.
Right.
One is Luddistan, another one is neo-feudalism, another one is Faldistan, and then technosocialism ultimately is in the top right corner of that diagram, which is, we've been conditioned to believe that's always the optimal corner to be in. Share with us a little bit about that. And I want to hear Kasey's perspective as we kind of steer to a conclusion, what the implications are here. Because I think what we've done, Kasey, is we've discovered that while you have a really interesting report, once you start to unpack the implications of that report, and we barely began to do that in this episode, you start to open up a series of cans of worms. And it's like, wow, that's a nasty scenario. And we don't need to push this scenario further than we've already done it. But I would love to hear Brett just recap those 4 scenarios briefly, and then I'd love to get Kasey's reaction to each.
Sure. So this is how we modeled future socio-political economic organizing principles, right? 2 basic axes. One is individual over collective. So, if you look at the European economies, they tend to be more collectively oriented, whereas the US tends to place more emphasis on individual rights, right? So individual rights versus collective rights. And then on the other axis, it's chaotic futures versus planned futures. So, like the Great Reset, type principles principles, we're planning for the future and we're mapping this out over many decades versus, we'll just, free market, we'll see what happens, right? So that's the 4 quadrants. So in the collective chaotic, you have the ladder stand scenario. This is where we ban AI specifically because of the effect it's having on unemployment, and we can't figure out how to pay for UBI. So the only way to stop machines taking jobs is to ban them from taking jobs. That's a fairly small percentage in terms of likelihood. Then you've got the individual chaotic, which is the Faldestan, where individually focused economies don't really focus on collective solutions, and so they leave it too late. For things like response to climate change and so forth, and it produces basically systemic collapse. On the
Faldestan is the United States, is what you're describing.
Well, so Faldestan, it could be the outcome, but more likely in the United States is going to be what we call neo-feudalism, which is the collective plan, where you have the wealthy elite sort of trying to construct a society where you have this permanent stratification of the landlord class or the feudal class. You have the poor versus the rich, and the rich get, longevity treatments and have access to all the best stuff, but if you can't afford to be in that group, then you're left to your own devices. So the Elysium sort of sci-fi future. But we argue the optimal form of humanity, one that focuses on the outcome for the species wide, is techno-socialism, using technology to reduce the cost of government and produce a better quality of life for all. Right. So they're the 4 scenarios that we put in the book. So I'd love to hear, Kasey, what your thoughts are in terms of the likely outcomes of those.
Yeah, Brett, I look at all of those and say they're all possible outcomes. In particular, if you sort of think about where we're heading currently in the United States, you'd look at neo-feudalism and you'd say that feels like the direction we're heading. But part of what we took on this effort for was to establish an understanding of the possibilities and the forces, but more importantly is like surface the choices, because this isn't fait accompli that we end up somewhere. We actually will end up at the place that our collective choices take us. And if you don't understand our collective,
having the conversation, right?
Yeah, if we don't understand the forces and what those choices are, then yes, we'll end up wherever we end up. We want, our firm I passionately want to be part of helping to understand the choices that we have to make, to pick the place that we play. Like, what is the future that we desire? And what do we have to do collectively? And if you stop and think about the agency that we have collectively, I mean, Deloitte is a massive organization where I'm proud of the influence that we have. But frankly, the number of people that we have, the number of people that you reach via this podcast, collectively, we have a ton. We have so much agency, and we have to employ that agency to help us get to the place we want to get to, the future that we want, our outcome, and that's why we've taken this effort. We call it buying in the better, and we're as focused on ourselves and what's the role that we as a firm have to play in creating that future, as we are in trying to help our clients to also understand the role that they need to play.
So then the obvious question is, how do we guarantee a more collective outcome versus arguing over whether our tribe or our economic group wins?
No, I think that's right, is to understand what are the limitations we have of making the right collective decisions today, and how do we begin to address the shared outcomes. And it's not easy. I can't just give you an answer that says, here's how you do it, but it certainly takes collaboration. It takes participation by governments. It takes, investment by, global corporations that have connective tissue globally. And it takes real concerted effort to align the outcomes, with the decision-making that, drives those outcomes.
I think it takes better incentives, frankly. I think the market incentives are, what we describe as perverse incentives economically. But anyway, that's great, Kasey. Thanks for joining us, man.
Oh, thanks for the opportunity. As you hear, there's so much to talk about.
Yeah, that's true. We barely got into it. Kasey, it was great seeing you today. Thanks for joining us.
Nice seeing you, Robert.
Kasey, just quickly before we go, where can people get in touch with you? Find out more about the report?
Yeah, you can find me on LinkedIn, Kasey Lobaugh. You can follow me on Twitter, or you at KLOBAUGH, or just Google, buying into better, Deloitte, and you'll find us.
Fantastic. So great to have you on the show. Thanks for joining us. That's it for the show this week, guys. If you enjoy the show, make sure you tweet it out, share it with your friends. It's how people find out about the show. Or leave us a 5-star rating. It all helps raise visibility. We have a phenomenal traction on the show right now, so appreciate all of that. And if you've got some ideas for future shows, please jump in and let us know what you think, who you'd like to hear us interview, and what topics you'd like us to cover. Maybe we'll get into the whole UAP UFO thing, because that's getting a lot more attention these days. But anyway, so that's it for the show this week. Until next week, we will see you in the future.
Well, that's it for the Futurists this week. If you like the show, we sure hope you did. Please subscribe and share it with the people in your community. And don't forget to leave us a 5-star review. That really helps other people find the show. And you can ping us anytime on Instagram and Twitter at Futurist Podcast for the folks that you'd like to see on the show or the questions that you'd like us to ask. Thanks for joining. And as always, we'll see you in the future.